All right, this is from last week, and we got Putin ordering the withdrawal of Russian forces.
Russian President Vladimir Putin says he will order the partial pullout of the country's military from Syria on Tuesday. Now, Putin made the remarks in a meeting with his defense and foreign ministers in the Kremlin. The president said that the Russian forces have largely fulfilled their objective in Syria. According to Putin, Russian forces set the stage for Syria peace talks. Putin also called on the foreign ministry to intensify Moscow's role in the peace process. He added that the decision will not affect the air base in Syria's Latakia province, as well as a naval facility in the Syrian port city of Tartus. Meanwhile, the Kremlin spokesman said Putin has informed Syrian President Bashar al-Assad of the decision and that Assad has agreed to the withdrawal.
So, what do you think the United States does now?
Well, the United States says it has deployed a number of its Marines to Iraq. The U.S. military says the soldiers are from the 26th Marine Expeditionary Unit. They are said to be on a mission to help U.S. forces already deployed in Iraq. Washington says its troops fight against Daesh terrorists and train Iraqi forces. Many, however, are critical of Washington's military intervention in Iraq for not being effective and serious.
Okay, now for a little history lesson. ISIS attacked Syria from Iraq. It first attacked Iraq, stole a whole bunch of equipment, and then went on to attack Ramadi, and then eventually, I can't even remember the name of the other city. That's where ISIS came from. It came from Iraq, and now the Marines are back in Iraq, and guess what? They're training the depleted ISIS forces. That's what they're doing. That's what they've always done. They're a proxy army. That's why we never bombed their oil convoys. The oil convoys we didn't even know about even in this old video, we don't even know about their oil convoys out of Iraq and Syria. It wasn't until the Russians bombed the oil convoys that we found out they were actually oil convoys and they're stealing oil. This is, the people in Washington, they just don't know when to quit. You would think that with the Russian withdrawal, it would be a calming of the situation. It obviously isn't. Again, escalation. That's all Washington knows.
Then one of Iraq's most strategic cities, Tikrit, is now in the midst of a fierce battle in Baghdad's largest anti-Islamic state operation to date. The city's been in the hands of jihadists for just under a year now, but up to 30,000 Iraqi troops now are closing in on that stronghold. Almost all residents have fled. And Iraq's also just revealed, too, the amount of weapons it lost to Islamic State recently. Baghdad's admitted losing more than 2,000 Humvees and other weapons when it lost the city of Mosul to the jihadists last year. The extremists posted these images online, indeed, claiming that they seized US-supplied hardware. And that's far from the only case, too, when American weapons appear to have ended up in the hands of Islamic State. We obtained this video showing the Iraqi military entering a warehouse abandoned by the jihadists. It was littered with US-supplied equipment. Over the border, too, last year in Syria, the US mistakenly airdropped weapons right into Islamic State's hands. The aid was meant for Kurdish forces that were bitterly fighting the terrorists for a border town at the time, but it all fell off course. Let's bring in Jeremy Saltz to get some thoughts about this. He's a political analyst. Hi, Jeremy. Do you think Islamic State's advance would have been so successful without access to this US military hardware by mistake, by default?
Let me just briefly revise the history of American blunders, so-called, over the last couple of years with regard to weapons ending up in the hands of the Islamic State. The first one was the one you mentioned, the accidental airdropping of weaponry into Islamic State-controlled territory, not once but several times. The last year, early June, we had the Islamic State taking over Mosul. Now here we have a state which has the most advanced, most sophisticated global surveillance system of any country in the world. Yet, I mean, it can actually watch you scratching your nose. It can hear you cough. Yet it didn't see or didn't hear those pickup trucks storming across the Syrian desert in the direction of Mosul. Because when they got there, there was a massive American weaponry that they seized, including 2,300 Humvees and a massive weaponry and ammunition. Now, just more recently, we have exactly the same scenario played out in Ramadi. They take over Ramadi. They proudly kind of go in procession through the streets of Ramadi, a line of pickup trucks with men and machine guns that could have been obliterated from the air, exactly the same as
What's
Mosul.
this down to? Complacency, incompetence, or just the malaise of war, the problems of war, and just not being able to be across everything all of the time when you're in that kind of setup?
Let me just continue for a second. So we have Mosul, we have Ramadi, we have a second siege of immense quantity of American weaponry. Now we have the third kind of scenario when the Islamic State storms across the desert in the direction of Palmyra. Now, are we seriously to believe the United States couldn't see them coming, didn't see those pickup trucks racing across the Syrian desert? I mean, they create massive plumes of dust for one thing. And they get to Palmyra and they take over the city. So what explains all this extraordinary history of blunders? So we turn to the recent document released by the Defence Intelligence Agency in reply to Freedom of Information request. Now, this shows that back in 2012, the United States government knew and anticipated the possibility of a Salafist principality being established in eastern Syria. And it said that this was not inconsistent with American policy. And in fact, it was the rise of these groups, these Salafist groups inside Syria, was supported by all the governments that supported the Syrian opposition. And they knew that opposition was not moderate. We had Joe Biden saying exactly that. And they knew that the fighting groups were all Takfiri. So so what we're getting here is a real picture behind the picture that we've been presented in the media. Right?
Okay, you're saying blunders account for a lot of this. You've got the director of the CIA saying on Sunday that the fight with Islamic State is going to last for a very long time. These blunders or mismanagement, whatever you want to call it, behind it is not going to help that fight.
I don't think they're blunders. That's the whole point. They're not blunders. There's a strategy here. And I think a strategy, the long-term strategy, and Israel is partnered to this, is to break up the central lands of the Middle East into mini ethno-religious mini-states. Suit Israel's purpose and would suit America's purposes. Now, if we look at Iraq, for example, the invasion of 2003 destroyed Iraq as a unitary Arab state.
Well, I go back to that question. What's the CIA guy talking about when he says the fight against Islamic State is going to go on? That's just words.
Yeah, it's just words. It is just words. I mean, the United States is actually, insofar as Iraq is concerned in particular, and even in Syria, has not done a great deal to stop the advance of the Islamic State. If they'd wanted to seriously attack the Islamic State, they could have attacked them when they moved on Mosul last year. They could have attacked them when they moved on Ramadi. They could have attacked them when they moved on Palmyra. They didn't do a thing. So this is not all blunders and accidents. It's indicative of a strategy at work. And the strategy, I think, is that in Iraq, in particular, the US is using the Islamic State like an attack dog. It's being shepherded away from American interests, which of course is the Kurdish north and Baghdad, but it's giving the Islamic State a free hand in western Iraq and more so in northeastern Syria. Right? As I said, that document predicted the rise of a Salafist principality in northeastern Syria 3 years ago as a means of keeping pressure on the Syrian government. In other words, the Islamic State is actually the kind of group the Americans wanted for years, but couldn't get it. The Free Syrian Army was defunct and dysfunctional from the beginning.